April 18th, 1942, 0630 hours, Tokyo Bay, Japan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the imperial palace as millions of Japanese citizens began another ordinary day in what they believed was an impregnable fortress. For centuries, the sacred islands of Japan had remained untouched by foreign enemies, protected by vast oceans and divine providence. The Mongol invasions of 1274 and 1281 had been repelled by typhoons, the people called kamikaze, divine winds that proved their homeland's blessed protection. Now, in the spring of 1942, that unshakable confidence had reached its zenith. Pearl Harbor lay in ruins behind them. Singapore had fallen. The Philippines were crumbling. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces advanced with seemingly unstoppable momentum, validating every assumption about their invincibility. Yet high above the morning haze, 16 olive-drab shapes approached through the sky, carrying a message that would shatter 2 millennia of Japanese certainty about their homeland's security. The psychological foundations of Japanese invincibility had been carefully constructed over generations of isolation and triumph. The island nation's geographic position had created a fortress mentality that permeated every level of society, from peasant farmers to military commanders. When Commodore Perry's black ships had appeared in Tokyo Bay in 1854, they had forced Japan to open its borders, but they had also reinforced the lesson that isolation meant security. The subsequent Meiji Restoration had transformed Japan into a modern industrial power while preserving the core belief that the home islands remained sacred and untouchable. By 1942, Japanese propaganda had elevated this geographic confidence into something approaching religious certainty. Radio broadcasts assured citizens that enemy forces could never reach Japanese soil. Military leaders spoke confidently of expanding defensive perimeters that would push any potential threat thousands of miles from the homeland. School children learned that their islands were protected by spiritual forces that no foreign enemy could overcome. The stunning success at Pearl Harbor had only reinforced these beliefs, proving that Japanese forces could strike anywhere while remaining immune to retaliation. Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, understood better than most the delicate nature of Japanese strategic advantages. In private conversations with his staff, he had expressed concerns about America's industrial capacity and potential for technological innovation. Yet even Yamamoto believed that geographic realities provided Japan with fundamental security. The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean created natural barriers that no enemy force could overcome without establishing advanced bases within striking distance of Japan. Since Japanese forces controlled every potential staging area from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands, such attacks appeared impossible. The early warning system established around Japan reflected this confidence while revealing critical vulnerabilities. 650 miles from the Japanese coast, a ring of converted fishing vessels and small patrol boats maintained constant watch for approaching enemy forces. These ships, equipped with radio equipment but lacking radar technology, represented Japan's primary defense against surprise attack. The system had been designed by Yamamoto himself, who understood that early detection would provide sufficient time to mobilize the massive air and naval forces stationed throughout the home islands. On the morning of April 18th, the limitations of this defensive network would be exposed in devastating fashion. The crew of the Nido Maru, a converted 90-ton fishing trawler, peered through the morning haze at shapes on the horizon that defied immediate identification. At 0738 hours, lookouts aboard the small vessel detected what appeared to be enemy ships approaching at high speed toward Japan. The radio operator immediately transmitted a warning message, fulfilling the vessel's primary mission of providing advance notice of any hostile approach. The message that crackled across Japanese communication networks should have triggered a massive defensive response. Bomber wings armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs had been specifically assigned to destroy any enemy naval forces that approached within range of the home islands. Fighter squadrons stationed at airfields across Honshu stood ready to intercept hostile aircraft. Coastal defense batteries had been positioned to repel any attempted landing. Yet the Japanese defensive plan contained a fatal assumption that American tactics would follow conventional patterns. Japanese military planners had studied every possible approach to their homeland, and concluded that enemy forces would need to establish forward bases within several hundred miles of Japan to launch effective attacks. The distances involved made carrier-based strikes impractical using conventional naval aircraft with their limited range and payload capacity. Land-based bombers possessed the necessary range and firepower, but they required prepared airfields that simply did not exist within striking distance of Japan. The mathematical impossibility of the situation had convinced Japanese leaders that their homeland was secure from direct attack. The revelation that would shatter these assumptions was already approaching through the morning sky. 16 North American B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, each carrying a crew of 5 men and 2,000 pounds of high explosive bombs, flew at wave-top height toward targets that had never felt the impact of enemy weapons. These aircraft had accomplished what Japanese planners considered impossible by launching from the deck of an aircraft carrier over 400 miles from the Japanese coast. The USS Hornet, accompanied by the USS Enterprise and their escorting vessels, had penetrated Japanese defensive lines and achieved complete tactical surprise. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, the mission commander flying the lead bomber, understood the profound psychological impact his small force was about to create. The physical damage from 16 aircraft would be minimal compared to the massive industrial capacity of the Japanese Empire. Yet the symbolic significance of American bombers appearing over Tokyo would shatter fundamental assumptions about Japanese security that had shaped strategic thinking for decades. The raid would prove that no target was beyond American reach, and that geographic isolation no longer provided meaningful protection in the age of modern warfare. The approaching bombers represented more than military innovation. They embodied American industrial and technological capabilities that Japanese intelligence had consistently underestimated. Each B-25 had been extensively modified to carry maximum fuel loads while maintaining adequate bomb capacity for the mission. The aircraft had been stripped of unnecessary equipment, fitted with additional fuel tanks, and equipped with special low-altitude bomb sites designed for the high-speed attacks planned over Japanese cities. These modifications reflected American engineering expertise and manufacturing flexibility that would prove decisive throughout the Pacific War. The crews manning these bombers represented a different kind of military force than Japanese commanders understood. Rather than relying on samurai spirit and willingness to die for the emperor, American military doctrine emphasized training, technology, and tactical flexibility. Each crew member had received intensive preparation for the mission, studying target photographs, practicing low-altitude navigation, and rehearsing emergency procedures. This systematic approach to military operations reflected cultural differences that extended far beyond individual battles to encompass entire strategic philosophies. As the bombers approached their targets, Japanese civilians went about their daily routines with no awareness that history was about to change forever. In Tokyo, government workers arrived at their offices and ministry buildings that would soon echo with explosions. Factory workers began their shifts at industrial plants that American intelligence had identified as critical to Japan's war effort. School children attended classes where they recited lessons about their homeland's invulnerability that were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. The psychological preparation of the Japanese population for this moment had been shaped by months of uninterrupted military success. News broadcasts celebrated victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, creating an atmosphere of invincibility that made the approaching surprise even more devastating. Citizens had been assured that American forces were incapable of mounting effective resistance, let alone carrying the war to Japanese territory. The confident predictions of military leaders and the evidence of Japanese conquests had created a national mindset that was completely unprepared for the shock of enemy bombers over the homeland. At 1200 hours, the first B-25 appeared over Tokyo at rooftop level, its olive drab paint and American markings clearly visible to astonished civilians below. The impossible had become reality as twin-engine bombers with red, white, and blue stars painted on their wings flew through the heart of the Japanese capital. Air raid sirens that had never sounded in anger began their delayed warning as the thunder of aircraft engines and the crash of exploding bombs announced that Japan's age of invulnerability had ended forever. The systematic destruction of Japanese assumptions about homeland security had begun with mathematical precision. Every bomb that fell, every target that exploded, every civilian who witnessed American aircraft over Japanese soil contributed to a psychological transformation that would reshape the entire course of the Pacific War. The divine winds that had protected Japan for centuries had failed to materialize, leaving the empire exposed to enemies who possessed both the capability and determination to strike at the very heart of Japanese power. The confusion that erupted across Tokyo as the first bombs detonated revealed the complete inadequacy of Japanese homeland defense preparations. Citizens who had never imagined enemy aircraft over their capital stood frozen in streets and doorways, staring upward at machines that challenged everything they had been taught about their nation's security. The air raid warning system, designed for theoretical attacks that planners believed would never occur, functioned with chaotic inefficiency as sirens wailed minutes after the bombers had already begun their runs. Japanese fighter aircraft scrambled from airfields around the capital, found themselves chasing ghosts through urban canyons, where the American bombers had already disappeared. The few interceptors that managed to reach combat altitude discovered that their quarry was flying far below normal engagement parameters, skimming rooftops and weaving between buildings at speeds that made effective pursuit nearly impossible. Pilots trained for high-altitude combat against conventional formations found themselves helpless against attackers who had violated every assumption about proper bombing technique. The anti-aircraft defenses that opened fire across Tokyo demonstrated another critical weakness in Japanese preparations. Gun crews manning positions that had never engaged actual enemy targets fired wildly at aircraft that appeared and vanished before effective tracking could be established. The light weapons available for homeland defense had been designed to engage conventional bombing formations, flying predictable patterns at medium altitudes. Against fast-moving attackers at treetop level, these guns proved worse than useless, their shells falling into civilian neighborhoods while the intended targets escaped unharmed. Radio communications between Japanese defensive units revealed growing panic as reports flooded in from multiple cities simultaneously. Controllers who had trained for coordinated responses to single-axis attacks found themselves overwhelmed by reports of enemy bombers over Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka, within minutes of each other. The scope of the attack exceeded every contingency plan, forcing commanders to improvise responses while their carefully structured defensive system collapsed under the weight of unprecedented tactical surprise. At the Imperial Palace, where Emperor Hirohito maintained his residence in the symbolic heart of Japanese power, the sound of aircraft engines and exploding bombs created a crisis that threatened the fundamental mythology of imperial invincibility. Guards who had sworn to protect the sacred person of the emperor found themselves powerless against attackers who could strike from the sky without warning. The psychological impact of enemy bombs falling within miles of the imperial residence shattered assumptions about divine protection that had sustained Japanese morale through centuries of isolation. Military headquarters across Japan erupted in frantic activity as commanders struggled to comprehend how American forces had achieved the impossible. Intelligence officers who had assured their superiors that enemy carriers could never approach within striking distance of Japan found their assessments proven catastrophically wrong. Communications centers that had been designed to coordinate defensive responses against conventional attacks became bottlenecks of confusion as reports of simultaneous attacks overwhelmed established procedures. Admiral Yamamoto, aboard his flagship in Japanese waters, received news of the attack with physical revulsion that left him temporarily incapacitated. The architect of Pearl Harbor understood immediately that the psychological tables had been turned in the most devastating possible way. His carefully constructed strategy of expanding Japanese defensive perimeters to prevent exactly this type of attack had failed before it could be fully implemented. The enemy had demonstrated capabilities that Japanese planning had dismissed as impossible, revealing fundamental flaws in strategic thinking that extended far beyond individual tactical failures. The industrial targets selected by American planners delivered a message about vulnerability that resonated throughout Japanese military and political leadership. Bombs that struck aircraft factories, fuel storage facilities, and military installations proved that American intelligence possessed detailed knowledge of Japanese industrial capacity and strategic weaknesses. The precision of target selection suggested that future attacks would be guided by comprehensive understanding of Japan's war production system, making every factory and facility a potential target. Civilian casualties from the bombing raids, while relatively modest compared to later strategic bombing campaigns, created the first direct experience of war's reality for Japanese non-combatants. Families who had celebrated victories in distant lands suddenly found themselves digging through rubble and tending wounds inflicted by enemy action on Japanese soil. The psychological distance that had insulated the home front from the war's consequences vanished instantly as American bombs transformed abstract conflict into immediate personal tragedy. Japanese propaganda officials faced an impossible challenge in explaining the attack to a population that had been assured such events could never occur. Initial news reports attempted to minimize the significance of the raid by emphasizing the limited physical damage and claiming that military installations had been missed entirely. Yet the undeniable presence of American aircraft over major Japanese cities contradicted months of confident assertions about homeland invulnerability, creating credibility problems that would plague government communications throughout the remainder of the war. The technical analysis of American bombing techniques revealed capabilities that Japanese experts had not anticipated. The modified B-25 bombers had achieved fuel efficiency and payload capacity that exceeded known performance parameters for medium bombers operating at extreme range. The precision of the attacks despite the high-speed, low-altitude approach demonstrated training and technological sophistication that challenged Japanese assumptions about American military competence. Intelligence officers studying fragments of American ordnance discovered explosive formulations and fusing mechanisms that indicated advanced weapons development programs. International reaction to the Doolittle raid created diplomatic complications that Japanese foreign ministry officials struggled to address. Allied nations that had suffered under Japanese occupation celebrated the attack as proof that the empire was vulnerable to retaliation. Neutral countries that had been impressed by Japanese military successes began reassessing their positions as evidence mounted that American forces possessed both the capability and determination to carry the war to Japanese territory. The psychological impact of the raid extended far beyond Japan itself to influence global perceptions of the Pacific War's likely outcome. Chinese forces who had aided the downed American air crews faced savage retaliation as Japanese commanders sought to prevent future assistance to enemy raiders. The massacre of Chinese civilians who had helped American flyers demonstrated the depth of Japanese fury at being successfully attacked on their home soil. This disproportionate response revealed how profoundly the raid had shaken Japanese confidence, and how desperately military leaders sought to restore their image of invincibility through brutal collective punishment. The strategic implications of the attack rippled through Japanese military planning, with consequences that would prove decisive in subsequent battles. Yamamoto's insistence on attacking Midway Island gained unstoppable momentum as naval commanders recognized the necessity of extending defensive perimeters far enough from Japan to prevent future carrier strikes. The resources diverted to homeland defense and the strategic miscalculations prompted by psychological shock would contribute directly to Japan's catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Midway just 6 weeks later. Across the Pacific, American forces monitored Japanese radio communications and observed the frantic redeployment of defensive assets that followed the raid. Intelligence analysts noted the transfer of fighter squadrons from combat zones to homeland defense positions, revealing how profoundly the attack had disrupted Japanese strategic priorities. The diversion of military resources from offensive operations to defensive preparations marked the beginning of a fundamental shift in Japanese military posture from confident expansion to increasingly desperate attempts to protect an overextended empire. The technological lessons learned from the successful raid influenced American military planning for the remainder of the Pacific War. The demonstration that innovative tactics could overcome apparent geographical impossibilities encouraged further experimentation with unconventional approaches to projecting military power across vast distances. The integration of Army Air Force's bombers with Navy carriers established precedents for joint operations that would prove crucial in subsequent campaigns throughout the Pacific theater. The reverberations from those 16 bombers would transform Japanese military doctrine in ways that revealed the empire's fundamental strategic weaknesses. Within hours of the last B-25 disappearing over the horizon, emergency meetings convened in government buildings across Tokyo as officials grappled with implications that extended far beyond the immediate physical damage. The psychological earthquake triggered by American bombs falling on Japanese soil had fractured assumptions that formed the bedrock of imperial strategy, forcing a complete reassessment of defensive capabilities that had been considered adequate just hours earlier. Emperor Hirohito's personal reaction to news of the bombing demonstrated how thoroughly the attack had penetrated Japanese psychological defenses. palace officials reported that the emperor, whose divine status was supposed to protect Japan from foreign aggression, had been visibly shaken by reports of enemy aircraft over his capital. The symbolic significance of American bombs exploding within miles of the imperial residence challenged fundamental beliefs about divine protection that had sustained Japanese morale through centuries of isolation. Court advisors struggled to explain how foreign enemies had succeeded in violating the sacred space around the emperor's person, a failure that contradicted core tenets of Japanese spiritual and political ideology. Military commanders throughout the empire faced the impossible task of explaining tactical failures that their own doctrine claimed were impossible. Intelligence officers who had dismissed the possibility of long-range carrier strikes found their professional reputations destroyed by 16 modified bombers that had achieved what their analysis deemed technically unfeasible. The mathematical calculations that had convinced Japanese planners that American carriers could never approach within striking distance of the homeland had been proven catastrophically wrong by enemy forces who refused to accept conventional limitations on naval aviation operations. The immediate redeployment of Japanese defensive assets revealed the extent to which the raid had disrupted strategic planning across the entire Pacific theater. Fighter squadrons that had been earmarked for offensive operations in Southeast Asia and the Solomon Islands found themselves hastily transferred to homeland defense positions where they would spend the remainder of the war protecting against attacks that might never materialize. This defensive reaction, while psychologically understandable, represented a fundamental shift from the aggressive expansion that had characterized Japanese strategy since Pearl Harbor to a reactive posture that would ultimately prove strategically fatal. Japanese naval intelligence began a frantic investigation into how American forces had achieved tactical surprise that their own systems had been designed to prevent. The failure of the early warning network exposed critical gaps in defensive coverage that had been obscured by overconfidence in geographic advantages. Analysis of the Nidomaru's final radio transmission revealed that the converted fishing vessel had detected approaching enemy forces exactly as designed, but Japanese tactical doctrine had failed to anticipate that American commanders would launch aircraft at maximum range rather than attempting to close the distance for conventional carrier operations. The technological implications of the successful raid forced Japanese engineers to confront uncomfortable realities about American industrial and innovative capabilities. Detailed examination of bomb fragments and aircraft debris recovered from crash sites revealed manufacturing techniques and metallurgical advances that exceeded Japanese expectations about enemy technical competence. The modifications required to enable B-25 bombers to operate from carrier decks demonstrated American engineering flexibility and problem-solving abilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about Western technological limitations. Radio intercepts of American communications during the raid provided Japanese intelligence with disturbing insights into enemy operational capabilities that had been consistently underestimated. The coordination between naval and Army aviation units during the attack revealed levels of inter-service cooperation that Japanese forces, plagued by institutional rivalry between Army and Navy commands, had never achieved. The precision timing that enabled simultaneous attacks on multiple cities demonstrated command and control capabilities that suggested American military organization was far more sophisticated than Japanese propaganda had acknowledged. The psychological impact on Japanese industrial workers created immediate concerns about maintaining war production schedules that were already stretched to capacity. Factory employees who had labored under assurances that enemy forces could never reach Japanese soil suddenly found themselves working under the constant threat of further bombing attacks. Productivity declined as workers spent time constructing air raid shelters and participating in defensive drills that had been considered unnecessary just days earlier. The psychological transformation from confident expansion to defensive anxiety began undermining the industrial efficiency that Japanese military operations required. Japanese diplomatic missions throughout the world reported immediate changes in international attitudes toward the empire's military capabilities and strategic prospects. Neutral nations that had been impressed by Japanese conquests across the Pacific began reassessing their positions as evidence mounted that American forces possessed both the technological capability and strategic determination to carry the war directly to Japanese territory. Allied governments that had been demoralized by months of uninterrupted Japanese victories seized upon the raid as proof that the empire was vulnerable to retaliation and that ultimate victory remained achievable. The search for scapegoats within Japanese military hierarchy revealed institutional failures that extended far beyond individual tactical mistakes. Officers responsible for homeland defense found themselves subjected to investigations that exposed systematic deficiencies in training, equipment, and coordination that had been masked by the absence of any previous enemy attacks on Japanese soil. The comfortable assumption that geographic isolation provided adequate security had prevented the development of effective defensive systems that could respond to unconventional attacks using innovative tactics. Medical facilities across the affected cities struggled to treat casualties whose injuries differed significantly from combat wounds that military hospitals had been designed to handle. Civilian doctors found themselves dealing with blast injuries, burns, and trauma cases that revealed the Japanese medical system's complete lack of preparation for homeland bombing attacks. The shortage of specialized equipment and trained personnel for treating air raid casualties became another symbol of how thoroughly the empire had failed to prepare for the possibility of enemy attacks on Japanese territory. Japanese aircraft manufacturers began emergency assessments of production facilities that had been considered immune from enemy attack when located deep within the home islands. The realization that American bombers could reach any target in Japan forced complete revision of industrial security procedures and dispersal plans that had been based on assumptions of geographic invulnerability. Factory managers who had concentrated production in large, efficient facilities now faced the necessity of distributing operations to smaller, less efficient sites that would be less vulnerable to future bombing attacks. The failure of Japanese fighter aircraft to effectively engage the American bombers exposed critical deficiencies in homeland air defense that went beyond simple numerical shortages. Pilots trained for high-altitude interception against conventional bomber formations found themselves completely unprepared for low-level attacks by fast-moving aircraft that violated every assumption about proper bombing tactics. The tactical flexibility demonstrated by American aircrews contrasted sharply with the rigid adherence to doctrine that characterized Japanese aviation training and operational procedures. Communication failures during the attack revealed fundamental weaknesses in Japanese command and control systems that had been designed for predictable defensive scenarios rather than the chaotic reality of surprise attack. Radio networks that functioned adequately during peacetime exercises collapsed under the stress of coordinating responses to simultaneous attacks on multiple cities. The centralized command structure that Japanese military doctrine favored proved incapable of adapting quickly enough to respond effectively to tactical situations that had never been anticipated by pre-war planning. The international propaganda implications of the successful American attack created immediate problems for Japanese diplomatic and information services that had spent months proclaiming the empire's invincibility. News reports from neutral countries that described American bombers over Tokyo contradicted official Japanese statements about homeland security and exposed the gap between propaganda claims and strategic reality. Foreign correspondents who had been carefully managed to report only positive developments suddenly had access to dramatic evidence of Japanese vulnerability that could not be suppressed or explained away. Japanese military production statistics began reflecting the psychological impact of the raid as workers and managers struggled to maintain efficiency while implementing defensive measures that diverted resources from manufacturing activities. The time spent constructing air raid shelters, conducting evacuation drills, and dispersing critical equipment represented a hidden cost of the American attack that would compound throughout the remainder of the war. Industrial efficiency that had been maximized through concentration and specialization now had to be sacrificed to reduce vulnerability to future bombing attacks. The strategic miscalculations that the raid exposed within Japanese military planning would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Admiral Yamamoto's insistence on attacking Midway Island gained irresistible momentum as naval commanders recognized that existing defensive perimeters were inadequate to prevent future American carrier strikes against the homeland. The resources that would be committed to the Midway operation and the strategic errors that would result from acting out of psychological desperation rather than calculated analysis would prove catastrophic for Japanese naval power in the Pacific. The technological race that the successful raid initiated would favor American industrial capabilities that Japanese planners had consistently underestimated. The development of longer-range bombers, improved navigation systems, and enhanced defensive countermeasures would accelerate as both sides recognized that the Pacific War had entered a new phase where homeland targets were no longer immune from enemy attack. Japanese industry, already stretched to capacity by existing military commitments, would struggle to match American innovation and production capabilities that would prove decisive in subsequent campaigns. The psychological transformation of the Japanese population from confident expansion to defensive anxiety had begun with those 16 bombers and would accelerate throughout the remainder of the war. Citizens who had celebrated victories in distant lands now faced the reality that modern warfare recognized no sanctuary and that geographic isolation no longer provided meaningful protection against enemies with sufficient technological capability and strategic determination. The divine winds that had protected Japan for millennia had failed to materialize when they were needed most, leaving the empire exposed to forces that would ultimately prove unstoppable. The cascade of consequences from those 16 bombers would reshape Japanese strategic thinking in ways that revealed fundamental weaknesses in imperial military doctrine. Within days of the attack, emergency conferences convened in government ministries across Tokyo as officials confronted the collapse of assumptions that had guided national defense policies since the Meiji Restoration. The mathematical certainty that had convinced planners that American forces could never reach Japanese soil had been shattered by enemy crews who refused to accept conventional limitations on what aircraft carriers could accomplish. General Hideki Tojo, serving simultaneously as Prime Minister and War Minister, found himself defending strategic decisions that had left the homeland vulnerable to attack from directions that military doctrine claimed were impossible. His assurances to the Diet that Japanese territory remained secure from enemy retaliation now seemed hollow in the face of bomb craters scattered across Tokyo and 3 other major cities. The political implications of the successful American raid threatened the carefully constructed narrative of Japanese invincibility that sustained public support for the empire's aggressive expansion across the Pacific. Intelligence analysts working frantically to understand how American forces had achieved the impossible discovered that their fundamental assumptions about enemy capabilities had been catastrophically flawed. The detailed technical analysis of captured aircraft components revealed manufacturing techniques and design innovations that exceeded Japanese expectations about Western industrial competence. Modified fuel systems, specialized navigation equipment, and custom ordnance delivery mechanisms demonstrated American engineering capabilities that Japanese experts had consistently underestimated in their strategic assessments. The industrial implications of the attack reverberated through manufacturing centers across Japan, as factory managers realized that no production facility was beyond enemy reach. Aircraft plants, steel mills, shipyards, and munitions factories that had been considered immune from attack due to their location deep within the home islands suddenly required comprehensive defensive preparations that diverted resources from military production. The psychological transformation from offensive confidence to defensive anxiety began undermining the industrial efficiency that Japanese military operations required to sustain their overextended empire. Japanese naval aviation units stationed throughout the Pacific received emergency orders to redeploy aircraft and personnel for homeland defense missions that had been considered unnecessary just hours earlier. Experienced pilots who had been preparing for offensive operations in Southeast Asia and the Solomon Islands found themselves assigned to intercept duties that might never materialize but that high command could no longer dismiss as impossible. This reactive deployment represented a fundamental shift from the aggressive tactics that had characterized Japanese strategy since Pearl Harbor to a defensive posture that would ultimately prove strategically fatal. The failure of coastal radar installations to detect approaching American aircraft exposed critical gaps in Japanese early warning systems that had been masked by overconfidence in geographic advantages. Technical investigations revealed that existing radar coverage was designed to detect conventional naval approaches rather than the high-speed, low-altitude attack profiles that American bombers had employed. The equipment itself, much of it based on German technology that had been incompletely understood and inadequately deployed, proved insufficient for the comprehensive surveillance that Homeland Defense required. Medical personnel across the affected cities struggled to treat casualties whose injuries reflected the new reality of modern warfare being waged against civilian populations. Hospital administrators who had prepared for treating military casualties from distant battlefields found themselves overwhelmed by blast injuries, burns, and psychological trauma cases that revealed the Japanese medical system's complete lack of preparation for homeland bombing attacks. The shortage of specialized equipment and trained personnel for treating air raid casualties became another symbol of how thoroughly the empire had failed to anticipate the possibility of enemy attacks on Japanese territory. Japanese aircraft manufacturers began emergency assessments of production vulnerabilities that had been ignored when facilities were considered beyond enemy reach. The concentration of critical manufacturing capabilities in large, efficient installations now appeared as dangerous vulnerability rather than strategic advantage. Factory managers who had maximized production through centralized operations faced the necessity of dispersing critical activities to smaller, less efficient sites that would be less attractive targets for future bombing attacks. The psychological impact on Japanese military leadership extended far beyond immediate tactical considerations to encompass fundamental questions about strategic doctrine that had guided imperial expansion since the invasion of China. Officers who had built careers on assumptions of Japanese technological and spiritual superiority found themselves confronting evidence that American forces possessed both the innovative capability and operational flexibility to achieve objectives that Japanese planning had deemed impossible. The comfortable certainty that had sustained military confidence through years of conquest evaporated as commanders grappled with enemies who refused to accept conventional limitations on what could be accomplished through creative tactical thinking. Radio communications intercepted during and after the attack provided Japanese intelligence with disturbing insights into American operational capabilities that had been consistently underestimated by imperial planners. The coordination between different aircraft, the precision timing of simultaneous attacks on multiple targets, and the sophisticated navigation techniques required to locate specific installations in unfamiliar territory demonstrated levels of training and technological sophistication that challenged every assumption about Western military competence. The casual professionalism displayed by American aircrews contrasted sharply with the rigid adherence to doctrine that characterized Japanese aviation operations. The search for explanations within Japanese military hierarchy revealed institutional failures that extended far beyond individual tactical mistakes to encompass systematic deficiencies in strategic thinking and operational preparation. The early warning system that had failed to prevent the attack had been designed by competent officers using reasonable assumptions about enemy capabilities and likely attack profiles. The failure lay not in technical incompetence, but in the fundamental inability to anticipate that American forces would employ tactics that violated conventional military wisdom about how carrier aviation operations should be conducted. Japanese diplomatic missions throughout Asia reported immediate changes in attitudes among occupied populations who had been impressed by Japanese military invincibility during the previous months of conquest. The news that American bombers had successfully attacked the Japanese homeland spread rapidly through underground networks in occupied territories, providing encouragement to resistance movements that had been demoralized by seemingly unstoppable Japanese advances. The psychological impact of demonstrating Japanese vulnerability extended far beyond the immediate military implications to encompass the entire structure of imperial control across occupied Asia. Industrial production statistics began reflecting the hidden costs of implementing defensive measures that had been considered unnecessary before the American attack. The time required to construct air raid shelters, conduct evacuation drills, and disperse resources from manufacturing activities that were considered critical equipment represented a significant diversion of already stretched to capacity by military requirements. Factory efficiency that had been maximized through concentration and specialization now had to be sacrificed to reduce vulnerability to future bombing attacks that might or might not materialize. The technological race that the successful raid initiated would favor American capabilities in ways that Japanese planners were only beginning to understand. The development of longer-range aircraft, improved defensive systems, and enhanced coordination between different military services would accelerate as both sides recognized that the Pacific War had entered a new phase where traditional geographic barriers no longer provided meaningful protection. Japanese industry, already committed to maximum production for existing military operations, would struggle to match American innovation and manufacturing flexibility that would prove decisive in subsequent campaigns. Emperor Hirohito's private discussions with court advisors revealed the profound psychological impact that the attack had created at the highest levels of Japanese leadership. The symbolic significance of enemy bombs exploding within miles of the imperial palace challenged fundamental beliefs about divine protection that had sustained Japanese morale through centuries of isolation. Palace officials struggled to reconcile the emperor's supposed divine status with the undeniable reality that foreign enemies had successfully violated the sacred space around his residence, creating theological and political problems that had no precedent in Japanese history. The immediate reallocation of Japanese defensive resources revealed how thoroughly the raid had disrupted strategic planning across the entire Pacific theater. Anti-aircraft batteries that had been scheduled for deployment to forward positions found themselves retained for homeland defense against future attacks that might never occur. Fighter squadrons that had been earmarked for offensive operations received new missions to patrol Japanese airspace against enemies who had demonstrated the capability to appear without warning from directions that defensive planners had considered impossible. Japanese naval intelligence began comprehensive investigations into how American forces had achieved tactical surprise, despite the early warning systems that had been specifically designed to prevent such attacks. The analysis revealed that existing detection methods were adequate for conventional threats, but had proven insufficient against enemies who employed innovative tactics that violated established patterns of naval warfare. The failure represented not technical incompetence, but conceptual limitations that prevented Japanese planners from anticipating tactical innovations that their own doctrine would never have considered. The international propaganda implications of the successful American attack created immediate challenges for Japanese information services that had spent months proclaiming the empire's invincibility to audiences throughout Asia and the Pacific. News reports from neutral countries describing American bombers over Tokyo contradicted official Japanese statements about homeland security and exposed the gap between propaganda claims and strategic reality. Foreign correspondents who had been carefully managed to report only positive developments suddenly had access to dramatic evidence of Japanese vulnerability that could not be suppressed or adequately explained. Communication systems that had functioned adequately during peacetime exercises collapsed under the stress of coordinating responses to simultaneous attacks on multiple cities, separated by hundreds of miles. The centralized command structure that Japanese military doctrine favored proved incapable of responding effectively to tactical situations that had never been possible of adapting quickly enough to be anticipated by pre-war planning. Radio networks designed for predictable scenarios failed when confronted with the chaotic reality of coordinated surprise attacks that exceeded every contingency that defensive planners had considered. The failure of Japanese fighter aircraft to effectively engage the American bombers exposed deficiencies in homeland air defense that went far beyond simple numerical shortages to encompass fundamental problems with training, equipment, and tactical doctrine. Pilots who had achieved success against Chinese and early Allied opponents found themselves completely unprepared for low-level attacks by fast-moving aircraft that employed tactics their training had never addressed. The rigid adherence to established procedures that characterized Japanese military culture proved inadequate when confronted with enemies who improvised solutions to tactical challenges that conventional doctrine claimed were insurmountable. Japanese aircraft production facilities began emergency relocations that would reduce efficiency while increasing vulnerability to the transportation disruptions that American submarine warfare was already creating throughout the Pacific. The decision to disperse manufacturing capabilities represented a rational response to demonstrated American bombing capabilities, but it also acknowledged that the geographic advantages that had protected Japanese industry were no longer sufficient against enemies with the technological capability and strategic determination to carry warfare directly to the Japanese homeland. The strategic miscalculations that the raid exposed within Japanese military planning would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate tactical situation to encompass the fundamental direction of imperial strategy throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The psychological shock of successful enemy attacks on Japanese soil would drive strategic decisions based more on emotional reactions than calculated analysis of military possibilities and limitations. The resources that would be diverted to prevent future homeland attacks and the strategic errors that would result from defensive thinking rather than offensive initiative would contribute directly to Japanese defeats in subsequent campaigns, where concentrated force and tactical innovation might have achieved different outcomes. The technological lessons that American forces demonstrated during the raid would influence military development programs on both sides, as engineers and tacticians recognized that existing assumptions about aircraft performance, navigation capabilities, and coordinated operations required fundamental revision. The success of modified medium bombers operating at extreme range from carrier platforms suggested that traditional limitations on military aviation were more flexible than conventional wisdom had indicated, opening possibilities for future operations that would challenge established concepts of what air power could accomplish under innovative leadership and creative tactical thinking. The psychological transformation of Japanese society from confident expansion to defensive anxiety had begun with those 16 bombers and would accelerate throughout the remainder of the war, as citizens who had celebrated victories in distant lands faced the reality that modern warfare recognized no sanctuary. The divine protection that had supposedly shielded Japan for millennia had failed when it was needed most, leaving the empire exposed to enemies whose technological capabilities and strategic determination would ultimately prove overwhelming despite Japanese spiritual advantages and willingness to sacrifice for the emperor. The reverberations from the Doolittle raid would continue reshaping Japanese strategy and American confidence for months to come, as both sides grappled with the implications of warfare that transcended traditional geographic boundaries and challenged fundamental assumptions about what modern military forces could accomplish through innovative thinking and technological superiority. The mathematical impossibility that had convinced Japanese planners that their homeland was secure had been proven wrong by 16 modified bombers, whose crews refused to accept conventional limitations on what determined aviators could achieve when capabilities and strategic vision that supported by industrial exceeded anything their enemies had anticipated. The cascading effects of those 16 bombers would expose vulnerabilities in Japanese military culture that extended far beyond tactical failures to encompass fundamental flaws in institutional thinking that had been masked by months of uninterrupted success. Within hours of the last American aircraft disappearing over the horizon, emergency committees convened in ministry buildings across Tokyo as officials confronted the collapse of strategic assumptions that had guided imperial defense planning for decades. The mathematical certainty that geographic isolation provided adequate security had been demolished by enemy forces who possessed both the technological innovation and operational audacity to achieve what Japanese doctrine deemed impossible. General Sugiyama Hajime, chief of the Army General Staff, found himself defending strategic decisions that had allocated minimal resources to homeland defense, while concentrating overwhelming force for offensive operations throughout the Pacific. His confident assertions to Emperor Hirohito that Japanese territory remained immune from enemy retaliation now seemed catastrophically naive in the face of bomb craters scattered across 4 major cities. The institutional arrogance that had convinced military leaders that Western forces lacked both the capability and determination to strike Japanese soil had been shattered by air crews who treated impossibility as merely another tactical challenge to overcome through creative thinking. Japanese radar operators who had dismissed early morning contacts as equipment malfunctions or migrating birds faced investigations that revealed systematic failures in training and procedure that had rendered useless when sophisticated detection equipment it was needed most. The German-designed Würzburg systems advanced early warning technology available that represented the most to Japanese forces had been operated by technicians who lacked comprehensive understanding of the equipment's capabilities and limitations. Cultural barriers that prevented Japanese personnel from fully absorbing foreign technical knowledge had created critical gaps in defensive coverage that American planners had somehow anticipated and exploited. The industrial mobilization that Japanese leaders had considered their greatest strategic advantage suddenly appeared as dangerous vulnerability when enemy forces demonstrated the capability to strike manufacturing centers that had been considered beyond hostile reach. Steel production facilities, aircraft assembly plants, and munitions factories that had operated at maximum capacity while relying on geographic isolation for security now required comprehensive defensive preparations that diverted resources from military manufacturing. The efficiency gains achieved through concentrated production methods had to be sacrificed to reduce vulnerability to bombing attacks that might target any installation anywhere within the Japanese islands. Intelligence officers analyzing fragments of American ordnance recovered from attack sites discovered explosive formulations and fusing mechanisms that exceeded Japanese expectations about enemy weapons development capabilities. The precision engineering evident in bomb components suggested manufacturing standards and quality control procedures that challenged assumptions about Western industrial competence that had shaped Japanese strategic planning since the beginning of the war. Technical specifications that American forces treated as standard equipment represented innovations that Japanese industry was struggling to achieve, despite having initiated hostilities with supposed technological advantages. The failure of Japanese interceptor aircraft to engage effectively with American bombers revealed training deficiencies that reflected broader problems with military education systems that emphasized spiritual preparation over technical competence. Pilots who had achieved success against Chinese opponents and early Allied resistance found themselves completely unprepared for enemies who employed tactics that violated every principle their instructors had taught them about proper aerial combat. The rigid adherence to established procedures that Japanese aviation culture demanded proved inadequate when confronted with adversaries who improvised solutions to tactical challenges that conventional training had never addressed. Communication breakdowns during the attack exposed command and control weaknesses that had been concealed by the absence of any previous enemy operations against Japanese territory. Radio networks designed for coordinating responses to predictable threats collapsed under the stress of managing simultaneous attacks on targets separated by hundreds of miles. The centralized decision-making structure that Japanese military doctrine favored became a critical vulnerability when senior commanders found themselves paralyzed by tactical situations that exceeded every contingency their staff planning had considered possible. Japanese naval aviation units throughout the Pacific received emergency redeployment orders that revealed how profoundly the homeland attack had disrupted strategic priorities that had been carefully developed over months of successful expansion. Experienced air crews who had been preparing for offensive operations in Southeast Asia found themselves assigned to intercept missions that might never materialize, but that high command could no longer dismiss as theoretically impossible. The psychological transformation from confident aggression to defensive anxiety represented a fundamental shift in imperial strategy that would influence every subsequent military decision. Medical facilities in the affected cities struggled with casualty patterns that differed significantly from combat injuries that military hospitals had been designed to handle. Doctors trained to treat battlefield wounds found themselves dealing with blast injuries, burns, and psychological trauma cases that revealed the Japanese medical system's complete lack of preparation for civilian casualties resulting from strategic bombing attacks. The shortage of specialized equipment and trained personnel for treating air raid victims became another symbol of how thoroughly the empire had failed to anticipate that modern warfare might extend beyond traditional military targets to encompass entire urban populations. The search for scapegoats within Japanese command hierarchy revealed institutional problems that extended far beyond individual failures to encompass systematic deficiencies in strategic thinking that had been masked by early military successes. Officers responsible for homeland defense found themselves subjected to investigations that exposed training inadequacies, equipment shortages, and coordination failures that had been ignored while attention focused on offensive operations in distant theaters. The comfortable assumption that geographic barriers provided adequate security had prevented the development of effective defensive capabilities that could respond to unconventional attacks employing innovative tactics. Japanese aircraft manufacturers began emergency assessments of production vulnerabilities that had been dismissed when facilities were considered immune from enemy attack due to their location deep within the home islands. The concentration of critical manufacturing capabilities in large installations that maximized efficiency now appeared as dangerous vulnerability rather than strategic advantage. Factory managers who had optimized operations through centralized production faced the necessity of dispersing activities to smaller sites that would be less attractive targets but significantly less efficient in terms of output and resource utilization. Radio intercepts of American communications during the attack provided Japanese intelligence with disturbing evidence of enemy coordination capabilities that had been consistently underestimated by imperial planners. The precision timing that enabled simultaneous strikes on multiple cities demonstrated command and control sophistication that exceeded Japanese expectations about Western military organization. Inter-service cooperation between naval and army aviation units during the raid revealed levels of coordination that Japanese forces, hampered by institutional rivalry, had never achieved despite sharing common objectives and facing identical enemies. The international implications of the successful American attack reverberated through diplomatic channels as neutral nations reassessed their positions regarding the likely outcome of the Pacific War. Countries that had been impressed by Japanese military achievements during the previous months of conquest began questioning whether the empire possessed the defensive capabilities necessary to protect territory it had conquered. The demonstration that American forces could strike the Japanese homeland despite thousands of miles of ocean suggested that geographic advantages which had seemed decisive might prove less significant than technological innovation and strategic determination. Japanese industrial production statistics began reflecting the hidden costs of implementing defensive measures that had been considered unnecessary before enemy forces demonstrated their capability to reach previously secure targets. The time required for constructing air raid shelters, conducting evacuation drills, and dispersing critical equipment represented significant diversions of resources from manufacturing activities that were already stretched to capacity by military requirements. Efficiency improvements that had been achieved through concentration and specialization now had to be compromised to reduce vulnerability to attacks that might target any facility anywhere within Japanese territory. The psychological impact on Japanese civilian populations created immediate challenges for maintaining industrial productivity that was essential for sustaining military operations across an overextended empire. Factory workers who had labored confidently while believing that enemy forces could never reach Japanese soil suddenly found themselves working under constant threat of bombing attacks that government assurances could no longer dismiss as impossible. The transformation from offensive confidence to defensive anxiety began undermining the morale and efficiency that Japanese war production required to support military commitments that already exceeded available resources. Emperor Hirohito's personal response to reports of enemy aircraft over his capital revealed how thoroughly the attack had penetrated psychological defenses that had been considered impregnable by virtue of divine protection and geographic isolation. Palace officials struggled to explain how foreign enemies had succeeded in violating the sacred space around the imperial residence without triggering the supernatural intervention that Japanese mythology claimed would defend the homeland against all foreign aggression. The failure of divine winds to materialize when they were most needed created theological problems that had no precedent in Japanese religious or political tradition. Japanese diplomatic missions throughout occupied Asia reported immediate changes in attitudes among subject populations who had been overawed by Japanese military invincibility during the previous months of conquest. News of American bombers over Tokyo spread rapidly through resistance networks that had been demoralized by seemingly unstoppable Japanese advances across the Pacific. The psychological demonstration that the empire was vulnerable to retaliation provided encouragement to underground movements while simultaneously exposing the fragility of imperial control that depended more on perceived invincibility than actual administrative effectiveness. The technological race that the successful raid initiated would favor American capabilities in ways that Japanese planners were only beginning to comprehend. Development programs for longer-range aircraft, improved defensive systems, and enhanced coordination between different military services would accelerate as both sides recognized that traditional geographic barriers no longer provided meaningful protection against enemies with sufficient innovation and determination. Japanese industry, already committed to maximum production for existing operations, would struggle to match American manufacturing flexibility and research capabilities that could rapidly translate tactical lessons into improved equipment and procedures. Strategic planning sessions that convened in the days following the attack revealed fundamental disagreements within Japanese leadership about how to respond to enemies who had demonstrated capabilities that conventional military wisdom claimed were impossible. Conservative officers argued for concentrating resources on defensive preparations that would prevent future homeland attacks regardless of the cost to offensive operations in other theaters. Aggressive commanders insisted that the best defense remained continued expansion that would push enemy forces too far from Japan to mount similar raids. But their arguments had lost much of their persuasive power in the face of evidence that American innovation could overcome geographic obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. The failure of Japanese early warning systems exposed critical gaps in technological development that had been masked by over-reliance on geographic advantages and spiritual superiority. Radar installations that should have provided adequate coverage against conventional threats proved insufficient against enemies who employed attack profiles that Japanese designers had never anticipated. The equipment itself, based on German technology that had been incompletely understood and inadequately adapted to Japanese requirements, functioned poorly under conditions that revealed fundamental weaknesses in both technical comprehension and operational procedures. Japanese aircraft production schedules began reflecting the impact of dispersal requirements that reduced efficiency while increasing vulnerability to transportation disruptions that American submarine warfare was already creating throughout the Pacific supply network. The decision to relocate manufacturing capabilities represented a rational response to demonstrated bombing threats, but it also acknowledged that the industrial advantages which had enabled rapid military expansion were no longer protected by geographic barriers that had seemed impregnable just hours earlier. Factory output that had maximized efficiency through centralized operations would decline as production scattered to smaller facilities that offered reduced vulnerability at the cost of significantly decreased productivity. VD. The cascade of strategic miscalculations that the raid would trigger throughout Japanese military planning represented consequences extending far beyond immediate tactical considerations to encompass the fundamental direction of imperial strategy for the remainder of the Pacific War. Psychological shock from successful enemy attacks on sacred soil would drive decisions based more on emotional reactions than calculated analysis of military possibilities and resource limitations. The defensive mindset that would result from homeland vulnerability would divert attention and resources from offensive operations, where concentrated force and innovative tactics might have achieved different outcomes against enemies who were still developing their own capabilities. Communication failures during the coordinated attacks revealed command structure weaknesses that had been concealed by the predictable nature of previous military operations against opponents who lacked the capability to mount sophisticated challenges to Japanese defensive preparations. Radio networks designed for managing conventional threats collapsed when confronted with simultaneous attacks that exceeded the capacity of centralized decision-making systems to process information and coordinate responses effectively. The rigid hierarchical structure that Japanese military culture demanded became a critical vulnerability when tactical situations developed faster than established procedures could accommodate. Medical personnel across affected urban areas found themselves treating injury patterns that reflected the new reality of strategic warfare being conducted against civilian populations rather than purely military targets. Hospital administrators who had prepared for handling combat casualties from distant battlefields discovered that their facilities were inadequate for managing blast injuries, burns, and psychological trauma cases that resulted from bombing attacks on populated areas. The shortage of specialized medical equipment and trained personnel for treating air raid casualties revealed another dimension of Japanese unpreparedness for warfare that extended beyond traditional battlefield encounters. The international propaganda implications of successful American attacks created immediate challenges for Japanese information services that had built their credibility on consistent reports of military victories and homeland invulnerability. News correspondents from neutral countries who had been carefully managed to report only positive developments suddenly had access to dramatic evidence of Japanese vulnerability that contradicted months of official statements about imperial defensive capabilities. The gap between propaganda claims and demonstrated reality began undermining Japanese credibility with both domestic audiences and international observers who had been impressed by earlier military achievements. Industrial security assessments that Japanese manufacturers conducted in response to demonstrated bombing capabilities revealed vulnerabilities that extended throughout the entire war production system. Facilities that had been considered immune from attack due to their location within the home islands suddenly required comprehensive defensive preparations that diverted resources from manufacturing activities while reducing operational efficiency. The concentration of critical production capabilities that had maximized output now appeared as dangerous vulnerability that required immediate modification, regardless of the impact on military supply systems that were already operating at maximum capacity. The psychological transformation that began with those 16 bombers would continue reshaping Japanese strategic thinking throughout the remainder of the war as military leaders grappled with enemies who refused to accept conventional limitations on what modern warfare could accomplish through technological innovation and tactical creativity. The divine protection that had supposedly shielded Japan throughout its history had failed when it was most desperately needed, leaving the empire exposed to forces whose capabilities and determination would ultimately prove overwhelming, despite every advantage that geography and spiritual dedication could provide against adversaries who treated impossibility as merely another problem requiring innovative solutions. The technological revelations that emerged from analyzing captured American equipment fragments would fundamentally alter Japanese understanding of enemy industrial capabilities in ways that their intelligence services had failed to anticipate. Within 72 hours of the attack, technical specialists examining bomb components discovered manufacturing precision and metallurgical innovations that exceeded their most optimistic assessments of Western engineering competence. The standardized components, precision machining tolerances, and advanced explosive formulations revealed production capabilities that Japanese industry was struggling to achieve, despite having initiated the war with supposed technological advantages over their enemies. Japanese ammunition experts studying fragments of American ordnance found themselves confronting evidence of mass production techniques that produced higher quality results than their own carefully crafted munitions. The consistency between samples recovered from different aircraft suggested manufacturing standardization that enabled reliable performance across thousands of individual weapons, while maintaining specifications that Japanese craftsmen could achieve only through intensive hand-fitting procedures. This industrial standardization represented a philosophical approach to warfare that emphasized reliable adequacy over perfect craftsmanship, a concept that challenged fundamental assumptions about how military equipment should be produced. The navigation equipment recovered from crashed American aircraft revealed technological sophistication that Japanese engineers had not anticipated from enemies they had dismissed as technically inferior. Precision instruments, radio direction finding equipment, and specialized navigation aids demonstrated capabilities that enabled accurate target location over vast distances without the visual references that Japanese aviators required for similar precision. The integration of multiple navigation systems into coordinated packages showed systematic engineering approaches that Japanese industry, despite its reputation for precision manufacturing, had not achieved in comparable applications. Radio communication equipment salvaged from American aircraft provided Japanese signals intelligence specialists with their first comprehensive look at frequency modulation technology that rendered their own amplitude modulation systems obsolete. The clarity, range, and interference resistance of enemy communications equipment exceeded Japanese capabilities by margins that revealed fundamental gaps in electronic warfare development. The standardization of radio equipment across different aircraft types suggested production coordination that enabled reliable inter-unit communication, regardless of which specific planes were involved in any particular operation. Engine modifications discovered on captured American aircraft revealed innovative approaches to extending operational range that Japanese engineers had considered theoretically possible but practically unfeasible. Additional fuel tank installations, engine tuning modifications, and weight reduction measures demonstrated systematic engineering solutions that achieved performance improvements through coordinated modifications rather than revolutionary technological breakthroughs. The practical nature of these modifications suggested American technical culture that emphasized solving immediate problems through available means, rather than waiting for perfect solutions that might never be developed. Japanese aircraft manufacturers studying photographs of American bomber modifications began emergency programs to determine whether similar range extensions could be achieved with their own designs. The analysis revealed that Japanese aircraft had been optimized for different operational requirements that emphasized maneuverability and climb performance over the extended range capabilities that American modifications prioritized. This fundamental difference in design philosophy reflected strategic assumptions about how aircraft would be employed in combat operations that the successful raid had proven inadequate for defensive requirements. Intelligence assessments of American pilot training standards, based on interrogation of captured aircrews, revealed educational programs that exceeded Japanese expectations about enemy preparation for complex military operations. The technical knowledge, navigation skills, and tactical flexibility demonstrated by American personnel suggested training systems that produced competent aviators in shorter time periods than Japanese methods required, while achieving higher overall proficiency levels. This efficiency advantage in personnel development represented strategic capabilities that could sustain operations over extended periods without the pilot shortages that were already beginning to affect Japanese aviation units. Japanese military academies began reviewing their own training curricula in light of evidence that enemy forces were achieving superior results through different educational approaches that emphasized practical problem solving over rigid adherence to established procedures. The tactical flexibility that American aircrews had demonstrated during the raid suggested training methods that encouraged innovation and adaptation rather than the disciplined execution of predetermined tactics that Japanese military culture traditionally valued. This philosophical difference in military education reflected broader cultural distinctions that would influence operational effectiveness throughout the remainder of the war. Technical intelligence reports distributed throughout Japanese military hierarchy acknowledged that enemy forces possessed manufacturing capabilities and design innovations that had been consistently underestimated by imperial planners. The systematic nature of American technological advantages suggested industrial organization and research coordination that enabled rapid development and deployment of improved equipment in response to operational requirements. Japanese industry, despite its reputation for precision and quality, was discovering that it lacked the organizational flexibility and resource allocation systems that American manufacturing employed to achieve technological superiority across multiple categories simultaneously. Production planning committees convened to address the implications of demonstrated American capabilities, began recognizing that Japanese industrial strategy required fundamental revision to match enemy achievements in standardization, quality control, and systematic innovation. The craft-based approach to manufacturing that had produced excellent individual examples of military equipment was proving inadequate for the mass production requirements that sustained extended military operations against enemies who could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. This realization forced Japanese industrial leaders to confront uncomfortable truths about their own limitations compared to American capabilities. Japanese research and development programs received emergency funding increases as military leaders recognized that technological competition had become as critical as tactical excellence for achieving strategic objectives against enemies who possessed both numerical superiority and systematic advantages in equipment quality. The resources diverted to technical development represented acknowledgement that Japanese forces could no longer rely solely on superior training and fighting spirit to overcome material disadvantages that were proving larger and more significant than pre-war intelligence assessments had indicated. The 16 B-25 bombers that appeared over Tokyo on April 18, 1942, carried more than high explosives and incendiary devices. They delivered a psychological payload that would prove more devastating than any conventional weapon, shattering Japanese assumptions about homeland security that had sustained imperial confidence for centuries. In less than 3 hours of combat operations, American aircrews had accomplished what Japanese military doctrine claimed was mathematically impossible, proving that geographic isolation no longer provided meaningful protection against enemies with sufficient technological innovation and strategic determination. The divine winds that had protected Japan throughout its history failed to materialize when they were most desperately needed, leaving the empire exposed to forces that would ultimately prove unstoppable despite every advantage that tradition and geography could provide.